Hello, Game Design. This is your instructor, Nicholas. I am going to be showing you how to implement scriptable objects into your project and hopefully showing you a pragmatic and or practical example of why using scriptable objects can be really helpful and beneficial in your own Unity projects. So scriptable objects, just as a little bit of a background, is a type of script or a type of code, C# script, that we will use that will act as kind of like almost like a data bucket that we can populate with various different variables and other information that we can use multiple different times or create multiple different variations of. So you can kind of think about these as being custom assets that we can assign particular bits of information to, whether it might be string values, integers, even game object or mesh renderer stuff. We can kind of create custom assets using scriptable objects and then loading in data into those scriptable objects. So you can use these in a variety of different ways. Like I said, I'm going to be hopefully showing you a pragmatic example of how you might consider using this in your own projects going forward. So I'm going to first just show how to implement scriptable objects into your project, and then we'll look at that example. So to get started, I'm going to go into my scripts folder, and I'm actually going to create a new folder in here that's going to be called scriptable objects. This is not required, but I just like keeping things organized, and you're going to see that the way that we generate scriptable objects is you're going to probably want to organize things a little bit for yourself. So I'll open that, I'll create a new C# script, and I'm actually going to call this treasure, because I think that that's going to be the example that I'm going to use a little bit later. So I'll go ahead and open this up once. This is the first kind of script that I'm compiling here in this session. So I'm going to go ahead and open this up into Visual Studio. And what we're going to do is we're going to change the class type of our script so that instead of it being a mono behavior, which is the class type that we've been using for all of our other scripts, right here, instead we're going to change this to be a scriptable object. Okay, and it auto-completes for me. So because this is going to be a scriptable object, we actually don't need any of these other kind of pre-built-in functions. And for the most part, scriptable objects are not going to contain any kind of functions within them. Again, think of these as just kind of data buckets that we can populate with whatever information or whatever data we want to. So I'm going to go ahead and delete the start and the update function. And I'm going to add an additional bit of information here to designate what I want the scriptable object to generate in my assets menu. So I'm going to create some brackets here, and I'm going to say create asset menu, parentheses, and then file name equals, and this is going to be the file type, or I should say this is going to be the thing that it's going to be looking for. And I'm actually just going to say treasure for this. And then I'm also going to say menu name. And then I could say the same thing for this, so treasure. So I'm going to go ahead and save this and not do anything else besides change the class type to be a scriptable object and say create asset menu, file name, treasure, menu name, treasure. And if I go back over to Unity, now this kind of compile for a second. Now when I right click in my asset menu and I go to create, you can actually see at the very top here that I have a treasure asset that I can generate. And so if I generate this treasure asset, If I generate this treasure asset, right, currently it has nothing kind of stored in that bucket here. But I probably want to name this something like, something like gold, or I don't know, something along those lines. So what I can do now is that I can start to populate this scriptable object with some data. So if I go back to Visual Studio, What I could do is that I could probably give this some variables here. So I'll say public int, and I'll say money, right, or money amount, and I'm abbreviating here, excuse me, semicolon. Public string, I could say contents, something like that. I could say public, let's see, what do I want to add here? Public, let's actually add a game object, and then say treasure obj to designate game object. And I'm going to go ahead and just kind of leave that as is for right now. So if I save this and I go back over to Unity and I click on my gold treasure scriptable object that I have here, you'll see that now, right, that data or those variables are loaded into my treasure scriptable object. So for this gold asset that I've created, I could say this is worth 100 gold. It has the content of gold bars, and I'm going to give it I can either give it a game object, or I could actually, the way that I'm thinking about this right now, yeah, I'll leave this as game object right now, because I'm going to create a prefab in order to populate into here. So I can go ahead and now iterate a ton of different treasure examples. I could say that the contents are a gleaming sword, they can be a beautiful suit of armor, they could have various different money amounts to them, they could have different, objects attached to them, kind of game objects attached to them. So that when I load them into the game, or when I instantiate them and use this data, right, I can use this data to kind of populate my scene with all of this information. So again, think of this as think of scriptable objects as an asset type that has preloaded in it, or kind of loaded into it by our design, specific variables and specific properties assigned to those variables. So that's we're going to kind of pause here for a moment to allow for this to kind of sink in that this is exactly what scriptable objects here, and we're going to shift over to looking at a pragmatic example of how to implement this.
A few moments later.
Okay, so we took a little break, and what I did is that I created a little kind of dungeon chest here that has a box collider trigger attached to it, and some other kind of 3D model asset stuff to it that also has collision on it. And what we're going to do is that we want to basically interact with this chest and display some information about what the contents of this is. So I'm going to be doing this really simply and just outputting it to the console, because just for the sake of time. But what I want to do is that I want to load this chest, or I want to load the treasure, right, scriptable object that I have made into this chest, if you will. That sounds a little bit strange, but if you kind of follow along in this process, you're going to kind of understand what I mean in just one second. So what I did is that I actually created a new script here that's just called chest items. And when I open that up, that basically has nothing inside of it, no information besides the default stuff. But what I'm going to do is that I'm going to allow for this chest script to load a scriptable object and load the data of that scriptable object into this script so that it is then associated with the object that the script is attached to. So the way that I do that is that I say public, and then if you think about what we had done for our treasure here, when we think about the file name that we made, right, that's going to be the type, the data type, if you will, of what I'm looking for. So I'm going to say public treasure, and then I'm just going to say chest treasure, something like that. Something very easy. Cool. So now all of the data that I've assigned here, the integer string and the game object that I have, and I did this a little bit backwards, so we might just get rid of this for right now, or just comment it out. All of that information has been now loaded in, or can be loaded in here as a treasure asset, okay? So on start, what I'm going to do is that I'm going to say Actually, you know what? I'm just going to do this very simply because just for the sake of time, I'm just going to show how this works. So I'm going to do void on trigger enter. Oops, trigger enter. Okay, and I'm going to say if, right, other game object is tagged player, right, then do this thing, and then I'm going to say if I don't think I've set up the input system yet in this project, so I'll just go ahead and say whenever this is collided with the player. Then I'm going to say debug.log, and I'm going to say treasure, chest, oh, hold on one second, chest treasure, and then I will say chest treasure money amount. And then I could also say debug.log chest treasure contents, right, to show what's in this. So now when I save this, I'm going to go back to Unity. I'll let that compile. I'll assign this chest items script to the game object that I have loaded here, right? And it will ask me, right, what chest treasure that I want to have loaded here. And I'll go ahead and in my Scriptable Objects folder, get my gold and assign that here, right? So now when I interact with this object, and I collide with it, right, it will show me in the console the money amount and the contents, right, the gold bars. So you're probably asking yourself, like, okay, well, why didn't I just hard code this, right? If I just knew that I was going to, you know, have this one instance of this chest, you know, I could just do this however many times that I wanted to, and I could just hard code this for every instance. In a dungeon, right, you're going to be having multiple different tests and treasures and things that you can collect, right, that will all have its own unique data assigned to it, right? So we can create a whole list or a whole kind of array of different items that could potentially be stored into this chest, right? And we could do that either randomly, or we could select particular items. We could be very particular with what we want to have in the contents of this. And as a result, then we can, you know, create multiple iterations of this prefab, right? I need to apply. I'm going to select the overrides, and I'll go ahead and apply all to that, so that my other chest now also has some treasure attached to it, right? And so I can continue to iterate and create multiple versions of these chests with different treasures associated with them. So, you know, I can create all of a sudden a system where I can easily iterate on my existing kind of objects that I have here, or by using a combination of prefabs and scriptable objects to create, you know, something really dynamic and really lightweight, right? So all of a sudden I can create a very complex system where I can continue to add information, right, or data to my scriptable object whenever I want to. I can continue to add more information. Maybe I want to add a description of what the gold bars are, or maybe, like I said, I want to assign a particular game object to display whenever you collect things, you know, and those gold bars are, you know, on display, right? So all of a sudden I've created a very complex system to be able to continue to expand and extend whatever it might be that you're collecting in this iteration across a lot of different, you know, types, if you will, or a lot of different possibilities. Okay, so I'm going to pause it here. This is kind of it for thinking about how you would implement scriptable objects in a very quick and simple demo of how you can think about iterating on that. I'm going to leave it to you to think about how you can continue to expand on this, but I'm looking forward to seeing how you can incorporate scriptable objects into your own projects. Okay, take care, be well, bye.